Welcome. Welcome to the Better Manager podcast. My name is Wendy Hansen, and I am the COO and co-founder of Better Manager. And I'm here today with Paul Larsen. But before I let him speak much, I'm going to tell you about him. Because today we're going to talk about harness your inner imposter and build your leadership brand. And that inner imposter, think about that, because we're going to talk a lot about that today. Let me tell you about my guest, Paul Larsen, who is an amazing coach, leader, and I've had the pleasure of working with him for many years. Paul is the author of the award-winning leadership book, Find Your Voice as a Leader. He's an accredited executive coach, game-changing leadership consultant, and a speaker. As a former C-suite executive for a $3 billion corporation, Paul has over 3 decades of success in harnessing his inner imposter in senior leadership positions at such iconic organizations as Adobe Systems, Charles Schwab, United Airlines, and Bristol Myers Squibb. He's an amazing man. Welcome, my guest, Paul Larsen.
Oh, Wendy, thank you so much. You know, listening to the intro, I'm like, oh, if there's something that triggers imposter syndrome, a lot of times it's listening to someone introduce you, especially as you're right nearby.
They're sitting there.
Who is that? Yeah. Who is she talking about?
Right.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I welcome the opportunity to converse with you and share whatever we can with the audience.
Yes, because we know both of us have been coaches for a long time now, and imposter syndrome comes up a lot. So I loved, this is one of your areas of expertise and your coaching and shows up in your speaking. So I said, this will be perfect today. So what do we know? We've worked with very brilliant people. Imposter syndrome. Give us kind of a little background, Paul.
Absolutely. So imposter syndrome, clinically, quote unquote, has been around for quite a while. In fact, I would probably argue it's been around since people have walked the earth, whether you were an imposter as a cave person or not. However, it was actually, I believe, clinically kind of diagnosed in the late 70s. And since then, it's kind of grown because people have become more aware through emotional intelligence, through other types of modalities and methodologies that we use to understand, wow, it really is something that people have, and how it can actually become part of who we are and prevent us sometimes from moving forward. So many times imposter syndrome, it's much more common. The latest study, I believe, a few years ago said about at least over 74 up to 76% of people have encountered it. And the good news is, since so many people have it or have experienced it, you're in great company, because many, many people have had it and have it continually. Yeah. So it's something that has been around. And the word that is a lot of times used for it besides imposter is fraud. Do you feel like a fraud at work? Or it could be anything. It could be in life. I'm sure parents have experienced it with their children, their first child especially, right? So
what am I going to do with this? Yes, am I the right person for this job?
Right. And it's very common. One of the common triggers or the common sort of awareness question that you would ask yourself around it is, are people going to find out? There's this element of being found out that people are going to find out I don't know what I'm doing. People are going to find out I don't know anything. People are going to find out whatever XYZ is. That is the trigger that will normally then take us into much more a deeper sort of syndrome around feeling like we're an imposter, feeling like we don't fit in. And that one day that mask is going to come off and people are going to find out that we are a fraud.
Yeah. I've had that experience on many, I think if people think, not in your whole life you feel like an imposter, but in experience. Right. When I first started coaching, I did a 3-day strategic planning workshop that I made up. And I was like, oh my God, this is how do I do this? And I'd have to go in the ladies' room and talk to myself and say, let those bad thoughts stay in here, like my gremlin talk, and go back in there. You can do this, Yeah. And that was definitely, when you talk about this, I viscerally could feel that imposter syndrome, and it all worked out, and it was a client for years. But it was like, do I really know what I'm doing? that
Oh,
shows
absolutely.
up for us.
And
Yes.
the brilliance of that story and that experience for you is the action you took, the anchor you took to say, okay, hold on a minute. I've got to go somewhere. Ladies' room, here I come. I've got to go somewhere that is going to sort of frame me, because that's what you did. You
I
separated away
took
from it.
this and put it there and said, you stay there till I get back. And then
Right.
I went back into the boardroom.
Right. And the brilliance of that, though, Wendy, is it's not, there's sometimes a conventional wisdom of we overcome things, or we need to get over something, or we need to get through something. You know, in life, you hear this a lot. Oh, move on, get over it, move on, move on. And that sort of is sort of how we, conventional wisdom has been how we move forward. Well, I have said, with myself included, with imposter syndrome, it's not about overcoming it, it's using it. And thus, how do you harness that inner imposter? How do you harness those feelings to really then move ahead to be even more successful? Because the people that have had imposter syndrome, the Tina Feys, the Maya Angelos, the Ariana Huffingtons, the Howard Schultz of Starbucks, they have harnessed it. It
Yes.
doesn't necessarily go away. In fact, Maya Angelou has a beautiful quote out there that she said, every time I write a book, she goes, I'm wondering, the late Maya Angelou, she was wondering, are people going to think, why is she writing a book? What gives her the right to write the book? Yet, with all the success she had, but it drove her to continue to author masterpieces, right? And messages that so impact us in terms of our community. So they've been able to use it and integrate it, which is what we do as coaches. We talk about blending and integrating things all the time. That's what you did. You were able to compartmentalize it, but you didn't overcome it necessarily. You then blended it in to what you were doing in terms of that particular session.
Right. In my experience, and with my coaches, we've coached over 700 people in the last 2 years at Better Manager. Imposter syndrome seems to come up as kind of a goal more for women than for men.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, I need to get over this. What's
Mm-hmm.
your experience of that, Paul?
So certainly, I can certainly understand, that particular, that particular that particular sort of idea or data point, right? And the one I think the sort of my explanation around that and my experience around it is, it definitely comes up for women. And if you read a lot on it, women always talk about it. But that's also because I do think with the advent of emotional intelligence, the
Yeah.
different leadership styles between genders, women will become potentially more vulnerable around certain things and communicate things in different ways. Thus, yes, definitely women will experience imposter syndrome, and then they will talk about it, and then they will go through and understand what that is. The male world, quote unquote, is built a little bit on the ego from a conventional wisdom. We
Right.
are moving towards, obviously, not just IQ, but the EQ as well. Well, as males have experienced their growth in organizations, we know this because as coaches and as executives and leaders in organizations, it hasn't always been accepted for males to say, I'm experiencing this, I need
Right.
help with this, or I feel like a fraud. However, when I look at my coaching, quote unquote, discipline and domain, my coaching portfolio, and I put myself in all of that,
Right.
I have experienced where clients of any gender, including males, have identified themselves as a fraud.
Yes.
And I experienced it, early on in my life, and certainly as I got into a mid-career pivot as well. So it definitely can be both genders. We probably see it more with women because of
Because they say it.
they say it.
They say, I need some help with this. Yeah.
Right.
Whereas a man may not tend to say that. Yeah.
Right.
That
Right.
makes so much sense. And that's
Right.
why the prevalence seems to be more on one side. Oh.
Right.
What I love is that, and tell me a little bit about your HR background, because you started in HR, and I loved our conversation as we were planning for this, because HR people have a big responsibility.
Oh, my word. First of all, HR people, and it doesn't matter the discipline of HR, business partnering, comp benefits, recruitment, sourcing, learning development, organization development. Every aspect of HR is critically important because you're dealing with the DNA of the organization, which is the people.
Right.
And it is so critically important.
And they are all humans and they come to work different every day.
They come to work different every day. When did they come to work different every hour? I mean, someone who walks in at 8 o'clock will show up differently at 11 o'clock. It's like, and that's the beauty of the mosaic of what a culture and an organization represents, and then how HR can work with those different styles throughout the day.
Yes.
And the piece around sort of the imposter piece, which I see a lot of times in HR, and I experienced myself, is because we put ourselves out there as HR professionals, whether it be ourselves as individuals, supporting a client, supporting a team, whether it be a program, a workshop, whether it be a process, a new policy, it is always out there. And it's like a perpetual 24/7 Amazon review. I mean, you're putting it out there. Oh, this was really great. Oh, no, this wasn't good. You're continually getting this feedback, even if it's unsolicited, right? Sometimes we want it. And then sometimes we're like, yeah, I really don't need the feedback right now.
Any more feedback right now? Yes.
But because of that, that feeds into our algorithm, our personal algorithm of our DNA. And it's easy to then take some of that feedback, and we don't always focus on that. We know this. We don't always focus on the positive or even the neutral feedback. When you look at that, we tend to go at that negative or constructive feedback. And that can add to like, oh my gosh, I really don't know what I'm doing. Or yes. I when in fact that may not be that may not be the result or the impact it should have anyway, but it feeds into the imposter syndrome. I in my early career at Schwab, I went into HR as a business partner, loved it. Figured out like different areas of discipline, had not been in HR before, focused on the coaching OD, and then learned what I needed to do around the specialty areas. And then fast forward a few years after that, I became head of HR, which was not at all my career trajectory. And I was like, oh my God, I'm head of HR.
How did I get here?
And I'm like, oh my gosh. And Wendy, it was sort of like, I was reporting to the CEO. I had good, trusted relationships. So that was all good. But I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. I mean, I'm like, or they're going to think, I don't know what I'm doing. I found out one day that Paul doesn't know, come and ask Paul to leave. Now, think about that. They're going to come ask Paul to leave. Who would be the people that would come and ask Paul to leave? Would probably be HR, which is what I was ahead of. So the ludicrous, the irony of that is not lost on me. Right. And I quote unquote kind of drifted in that a little bit. As you know, in coaching, we talk about the drift, where we just are kind of drifting. And I drifted and I was successful in aspects of my role, but I was drifting because I kind of was always having this sort of like, I'm kind of a fraud. I'm not really sure what I'm doing, until it was called out to me. It was called out to me by a mentor of mine. Just a lovely person. I was at an HR roundtable in San Francisco, and we had been sharing like different things that we're doing within our HR groups and our organization. At the conclusion of that, 90 minutes, my mentor came up to me, who actually facilitated it, and she's like, how come you didn't talk more about your role, what you do, what you've done, the fact that you are actually working through all these mergers and acquisitions, and Paul, you're like, you're the head of this HR. And I looked at her and I go, well, I said, Laura, I don't want to like take over the conversation. I don't want to like toot my own horn, quote unquote, unquote. And she looked at me and she's like, you're not like that anyway. She says, I'm going to call you out and I'm going to say that you feel like a fraud. And I'm telling you, Wendy, to this day, I'm telling you this was like 2005. So it was like, 12 years ago, 13 years ago. To this day, I know exactly where I was. I know exactly the conference room we were in. I know exactly. Yes. I can feel it as I'm talking it to you, because as soon as she called that out to me, it was also like a burden had been lifted. Like, you mean there's an actual sort of like feeling around this, or people have this? And I looked at her and I said, what do you mean by that? She goes, yeah, I thought so. She goes, let's go talk about what this is. And it was brilliant because it was the first time, it was almost like permission to
Yeah.
say, yeah, I do feel that way. I don't quite know what I'm doing. Help, right?
And when it's called out by a respected mentor, that makes that, just like as a coach, if a coach can help you see that, somebody that, then it's like, oh yeah,
You're absolutely,
that's
absolutely
great.
point on, because as a coach, I now take that episode, I now take that scenario, as we do as coaches, right? And if I'm feeling something with my client, I will ask those questions that will lead to that. And many times, not all the time, but many times it is that.
Yeah.
And many times I see that same relief wash over their face, or I hear it in their voice, if whatever it might be, and they're like, you mean I can say yes to that, and I do feel that way. And then you work on how you can harness that for your continued success and growth.
Right. Great. So I think we've laid a great foundation, and there are people out there that are probably saying, oh yeah, I'm glad it's not just me. And I'm glad that we're in great company with Maya Angelou and all kinds of folks. So let's talk about, how do we harness this so we make it work for us rather than be something that we feel like we've got to hide from, and
Yeah.
you've created great steps in terms of awareness, connection, and harnessing. So
Yeah.
walk us through those.
Yeah, sure. So it really, so a couple things. There are, it's around awareness. The couple of steps in awareness is understanding that it is, just as we talked about, it is something that is actually very common. You are in excellent company. You're experiencing this more than 9 times out of 10. The people nearby your work areas are experiencing it. You just may not know that, but certainly the world is full of people who feel that they are frauds or imposters. How you deal with that then, and how that comes out, is going to make everything around how convincing and compelling you are as a leader. The second thing is understanding, is in terms of the awareness, it comes from you. It's not coming from your audience. You're not at the Hollywood Bowl performing and they're all looking at you saying fraud, holding up a big sign saying fraud, 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 fraud. It is coming internally.
Yeah.
Because many times we're thinking, if you just go with what we just were talking about, right? We were talking about, well, they're going to think I'm a fraud. They are going to say, I don't know what I'm doing. They don't like what, it's always they. But
And then you keep look for evidence
right,
of your failure.
right.
Yes.
They're really
like, oh, they got to find out. Maybe this was
right. It's not like there's a bunch of theys over there in the corner, and they're pointing at you like, oh, Paul doesn't know what he's doing. It's you. So
right.
Understand two things around that. That awareness is, you are creating this within your DNA. You are creating the self-doubt. You are creating, and it could come from anywhere. We as coaches, we don't necessarily get into all the past pieces around that. We deal with the current. It is what it is right now, and you are dealing with imposter syndrome and fraud, but understand it is being manufactured right here in your own algorithm, your own DNA, and so you have the
I'm
choice.
the only one who can do something about it.
Yeah.
Right?
If it was coming from out there, yeah, you can't, there's only so much you can do. You can't really change people's thinking and judgments and worldviews and behavior, but you can change this.
But
So
I love
that's
that, because that's not imposter syndrome. That there, it's the
not at
imposter
all.
syndrome is here. Right?
Is here, is absolutely,
right.
is right here. So then you go into the connection piece, and the connection piece ties into kind of how you show up. And it ties into a lot around, we hear a lot of talk around executive presence, right? Does this person have executive presence? Does this person have that presence of that leader of when they walk in the room, or when their name is mentioned, and all the things?
Right.
Because a lot of times we hear a lot about executive presence. There's the art and science to it. And imposter syndrome has a lot to do with the art. So the science of executive presence is just around, do I show up? Do I communicate well? How does my voice sound? Do I pace myself? Do I have good facial expressions? My body language? How do I stand? How am I in a meeting? All those things are the science, which we can get down. You can still do all of that right and not show up with executive presence or a confidence of executive presence, because the art is around, if you're not confident, or you have that self-doubt, or you feel like a fraud, then you're dealing with imposter syndrome. And that's the connection piece. That's usually where people do the right things with creating who they are as a leadership presence, but they don't follow through because they actually don't feel there's a there within themselves. And that's connection. With connection, the 2 steps in connection is really connecting to your past. What have you done in terms of your successes, your legacy? What got you here? What are the successes you've had? What are the mistakes that you've learned from? We all have had that. To really look at those things and bring those out to yourself to say, wait a minute, I'm the head of HR, or I'm an HR business partner, or I'm a leadership facilitator, whatever the role. I have done these things before. I have lived a life like this. I have worked in these organizations. I have had these successes. Oh yeah, that last time I felt like your story around the strategic planning is brilliant, because that was something you just detailed to us that happened a while ago, but it's still fresh. That means you're using that, right? So you connect it to the past.
Right.
The second connection is you take that and you connect to the future. What's your future vision of yourself? What's your future potential? What are your goals and outcomes? What does that look like? What does that feel like? Those are exercises, as you and I know as coaches, we do with clients to get them to really think, okay, you're bridging the past to the future. Well, what's that bridge from past to future? It starts with a P, and ends with a T, and that would be present. And the present is where the imposter syndrome lives.
Yeah.
The present is where it lives and grows if we allow it to. So that's where we look at our past successes, we look at our future successes, and then we look at our present and say, okay, in order to bridge this, I need to harness this feeling of being a fraud and work on my confidence and self-doubt. So that's the connection piece.
Yes.
And
I
that's
love that you mentioned, like, I think we have to write these things down, and that we know from a neuroscience standpoint, don't just swirl things around in your head. Well, yeah, I've done this, that. Put it down, make a mind map or make a list and say, wow, I am pretty credible.
Oh, I know why I just love working with you, right? It's like, we didn't even prep this part of it, and you're like coming up with all this. So 2 things what you said was just like the swirl, right?
Yes.
We swirl.
We swirl in our brain all the time. We got to get it down somewhere, right?
We swirl so much, and we have that all up in here. You're absolutely spot on. And whether you write it down, like you were saying, whether you do a mind map, or whether I use a lot of visuals in my work, as a lot of coaches do, like pics and some type of visual that really captures. And I work with a lot of tech people and engineers that are up here, and they have the algorithms going up here. So I get them out of up here and say, pick a visual that represents your past, pick a visual that represents your future, and now pick a visual that represents your present. And then we go through and we deconstruct why they chose each one and the story behind each one. And what it does is it takes them out of writing all the adjectives down, right?
Yeah.
And they have to go out and search for some kind of picture. Whether, again, whatever that might be online, or sometimes we'll walk through a museum or walk in a park. It doesn't have to be anything that, a work of art. What it does is it just stops them. And it creates that deliberateness that we look for in coaching, for people to really think about, you're right. In the past, this is what I think best represents me. In the future, this is exactly kind of what I'm going for. And here I am in the present. So that's that connection piece. And that is so important.
Creating some kind of metaphorical way to look at it really helps us to bring it in. Yes. Yeah. Oh, I love that exercise.
Yeah. Oh, that's
something HR people can do with folks, that
absolutely.
Managers can do on a one-on-one. Let's
Absolutely.
think about this. What does that look like? That's
absolutely. Great. As you know, as coaches, many of what we do, our clients will take and work with their teams on. I mean, that's the brilliance of it. It's like, and for me as a coach, and this is why I've always loved working with you, is like, I keep it simple. I can't, I don't have, capacity up here for me, for models is great to some degree, but then I go, how do we take this to street level? Yeah. How do we make this happen from an action standpoint and a result standpoint?
Yeah.
So that's the connection. And then the harnessing piece is the last part of how you actually harness your imposter. And what I do when I work with folks is say, okay, we've done all this great work around your awareness, your connection. Now we're going to harness. And harnessing is presently taking that present piece, that bridge. What are going to be your 3 anchors that you're going to use for your anchors for success, your anchors for leadership, your anchors for whatever that might be. And I use the term 3 anchors because think of it as like 3 points of a triangle. Whatever has gotten an individual to where they are presently, they have come up with their own philosophy for success or their own philosophy for leadership. Now, when I ask them this, they're like, I don't know what that is. I have no idea. Or they'll pull out a book and say, well, my leadership philosophy is XYZ. No. That's not yours. That's the author's.
Right.
What's yours? And then we work on that because it comes directly from the work they did around the connection in terms of the present. And there they have their anchor, which is like a model that they
What's
then
an
use.
example? Give us an example of somebody that you've worked with, like what their 3 anchors were.
Oh, sure. So it very, I worked with one of the engineering leaders at a technology company. And when I asked the question, been an engineering leader for, a couple decades. And I said, what's your leadership philosophy? What's your model? Before we even started the harnessing piece. And he's like, I don't know. I don't have one. He goes, I just sort of kind of follow whatever people are doing and what I don't do and so forth and so on, which is in itself a model, right? So we worked on all of these things. And then when we worked on sort of the model, put up a triangle. And I said, what are your 3 points, your 3 anchors of success? What are the 3 things you want to do presently that are going to generate the results? And it's incredible. Inspire, motivate, and engage. And these were not necessarily 3 words or 3 actions that the leader had used at all in the past. It did look like from the future vision piece that was there, but now it was like, well, let's talk about what does inspire mean? And how are you inspiring? What inspires you? And he goes, well, that's where I feel like a fraud because I get up on stage. And he goes, I don't sit there on stage and I see all these speakers on stage that come before me and they're up there and they're like, jumping around and they're getting the group fired up. He goes, I can't do that. And I said, no, because that's not you. You have a quiet inspiration, right? We brought all this out and for the leader, it was like, wow, I can inspire in a different way.
Yes.
Because he thought he was a fraud around inspiring because he was using a benchmark of somebody else who may be inspiring in a different way.
Isn't that what brings out our imposter syndrome is comparison?
Wow. It is, absolutely.
I need to be like this one. I'm not like this one, so I really must be an imposter rather than you are not an imposter if you show up as yourself.
Absolutely.
Your best version of yourself. Yes.
Right. Your best version of yourself, and to understand how does that show up, that you will be an imposter if you try to show up as somebody else. This leader understood that if he showed up as somebody else, he would be called out as an imposter, which then prevented him from getting up on stage anyway. Yes. But once we worked through inspiration, once we worked through the outcome of motivation, which was his other piece around his own motivation and the motivation of his team, and then once we looked at what does the engagement mean? How do you engage? How do you build those relationships? Those were 3 things that we worked on really, really clearly. And it became his leadership philosophy. And then he started blogging on it. And once he started blogging on it, it became part of his own internal thesis, right? It became part of his internal DNA that he then believed in. And guess what? He started harnessing that fraud, that imposter syndrome to a point where it's like he got over the self-doubt. He worked through the confidence piece. And again, it doesn't necessarily go away. It just becomes integrated into your brand, into your style. And that's why I love the work that I do, because you just sit there like you do. I mean, it's like everyone's got all of this inside. It's about untapping that and getting and finessing that out to a degree so it's impactful for themselves, which of course will be impactful for their community.
Yes, and their happiness at work, they're feeling good at work, and the kind of mentor they are to others, all this. Yes.
Right.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And the other thing you touched upon is the one thing that does come up quite a bit is, and we haven't talked about explicitly, but that is the styles of being an introvert and an extrovert. Because those can play as well within cultures, within communities, within organizations. I work with a lot of folks that would probably identify as introverts on any type of assessment. And they find themselves a lot of times in extroverted cultures where the norm is XYZ, do this, be like this. Well, that's what organizations are like, right? You will be like this. We have behavior norms, we have values. So there's a pressure around that. Well,
Yeah.
as whether you're an extrovert or introvert, you want to just be respectful of what that style means to you. You want to be respectful of what the style means to other people and other people's styles, and then do what is going to be authentic or genuine to you.
Yeah.
So, a case in point, when we talked about all of these, when I talk about that with the leaders, that usually comes up to some degree.
Mm.
And the opposite, where extroverts sometimes will like, you know, I'm always out there, and I always feel like I'm always,
Right.
yeah, I
I
need to
don't get
sort
to
of,
go, whew, yeah, like
right,
slow
and I
down and reflect. Right.
exactly, and I need to pull back, or I need to be in
Yeah.
an environment where, so just it's another thing that does come up that can actually influence the imposter syndrome dynamic within somebody's own style or thinking.
Well, we always hear on the news about successful businesses have these charismatic leaders, and so you feel like if I'm not a charismatic leader that could stand up in front of a room, then I'm not going to be successful. So, what the introvert extrovert is really important, because if I'm an introvert and I looked at all business leaders have to be charismatic and hold the stage, and that's the only way you're going to be successful, I'm not going to feel very good about myself.
Exactly. Many times that obviously
And that's
plays
what
in.
we see all the time. That plays out in the news, and it's the charisma, and it
It's
really is. Yeah,
the charisma. So it's like, define charisma,
right.
reframe charisma. Let's deconstruct that, because we throw these words out there and then we use our own sort of benchmark of definitions for that. And then, but what we need to do is really like, anyone can be charismatic. It has no bearing on whether you're an introvert or extrovert, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're a cat or a dog. Anybody, any living can be charismatic. The key is, how do you define that? How do you make that your own? And
Right.
how do you create that from a purpose and outcome with sort of your deliberate steps around that? So, and the key is not to necessarily mimic others. And I think all of us can, if you remember Steve Jobs, when he used to get up in front of the audiences at Apple and the developers conferences, and he used to be introducing new things, he did he, worked the stage. He had his black turtleneck. Well, guess what happened after that? How many leaders did you see get up on stage in black turtleneck?
Turtlenecks. Right.
And I'm like, it's not to say that there's anything wrong with black turtlenecks. However, how is your
Pick your
personal
own style. What's your style
style?
going to be? What's
What's your
your authenticity in terms of how
Yeah,
you show up?
exactly. So that has everything to do with who are you, what is unique about you, and then how does that show up? And that actually dilutes sort of your imposter syndrome, right?
Right.
If you follow somebody else, like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and I will do this again because that person was successful. Well, guess what? You're only going to be adding to your own inner fraudness, so to
Right.
speak, because you're not really looking at your unique style.
Yeah. Oh, well, I hope this is as helpful to others as it has been to me, to kind of look at these. And from a coaching perspective, it's very helpful for me. Like, here's the language we can use on how to harness things,
Right.
what to do.
Oh,
You've got, you've got so many great leadership tips, and that's why you speak all over the world, Paul. You spend a lot
oh,
of time in Asia, and you're in front of business audiences, and I just love your message.
oh, you're so, Wendy, thank you so much. That definitely means a lot to me. I feel, you know, I looked at myself, and going back to the imposter syndrome, I looked at myself in 2009, and I had a wonderful job at a wonderful company, with wonderful colleagues and so forth. But I knew I had something else to do. I had a message to get out, and that was another part of, if I let the imposter win, I would have stayed at the company, and I could have done very well just from all the trappings of success we have. But I would have been feeling, I'm going back to that connection. I'm not looking at my future potential, my future vision. And I just feel it's so important for people to really understand whatever the baby steps are that you need to take. to take those steps, because baby steps are sustainable, they're scalable, and they will allow us to really reach and really look at that future vision. So when you say that to me, that means a lot, because it means that my impact and that outcome that I wanted is what I'm doing right now.
Yes. You're
And
able to, yeah, I'm moving there. I'm moving there. Yes. I
yeah,
love that.
and that's incredibly important. But it's something I constantly work on. So what are we, we're November 2018. And I am certainly looking at sort of the whole, like, I continually look to say, okay, do I have still feelings that come up around absolutely,
Right.
but it's about how you use it with awareness, connection, and then harnessing. And so
Yes.
that's the key.
That's great. And you have a wonderful book, that The Voice of a Leader, which I cannot grab my other bookshelf right now, which it's on. I'm not prepared, but I totally highly recommend it. So people should look into that. And if they want more information from you, Paul, how can they find you?
Probably the best way is my website, which is Paul N, as in Neil, Larsen, Larsen. I'm Norwegian, so that's the EN, .com. So that's the best way to reach me. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and Voice of the Leader is on Twitter. So many, many different ways to reach me. But I hope people can, to your point, look at themselves, understand that inner imposter, that inner fraud is common. It's about
I think that's the best message for me from today, is that we are in good company. It is much more common than we think. And you've looked at the stats. So it's like, okay, let's do something with this, and let's be ourselves, and let's know that the gifts that we bring, the strengths that we bring, are going to make a difference, and keep moving and accelerating our own growth. So
yeah, keep moving and keep going, and understand that, we can look at different ways of doing things. It doesn't always have to be the way we've always done it, because that keeps us in that drift. It keeps us in that imposter syndrome. Always look to say, maybe I could pivot and do something different for myself, my team, my community.
And when that little voice is telling you that in your head, take a little action. Don't
take a
sit
little
still.
action. Don't just accept the voice.
Right.
But take some action and really understand and question the voice and see what sort of the outcomes are. The voice is there for a reason. Use it and harness it.
Yes. Well, this has been wonderful chatting with you. We'll have to do this again.
Absolutely, Wendy. Thank you so much. This is an honor and wonderful, and I look forward to future partnerships with you. And you're doing such wonderful work, you and your team, and the team with Better Manager. And I just can't. I can only think about the impact you're making with managers and leaders, and then the people that they work with, which is like
the cascading effect. I have to say, makes us very proud. When
my
people
heart is
have
full.
learned things, and we want happier workplaces. That's part of one of my big values, is connection and a happier workplace. And then the whole world is better. So thank you. Thank you all for listening to the Better Manager podcast and our guest, Paul Larsen, and stay tuned for the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.